The USA bought Alaska from Russia for $7.2 million in the year 1867. Even if you convert the amount to today's standards, the United States got a real bargain here. But why did Russia sell a territory almost 5 times the size of Germany for such a ridiculous price? Let's start with the history of Alaska. This begins around 12,000 years before Christ. At that time, there was still a land bridge between the Asian and American continents, which is why the first immigrants from Asia migrated to Alaska. For many millennia, indigenous peoples lived here, leading a simple life. This only changed with the arrival of the Russians in the year 1741. Russia, which had been expanding further and further east from its center over the previous centuries, finally crossed the Bering Strait by ship and established its first outposts in Alaska. The Russian-American Company was subsequently founded, and the outposts were primarily intended to hunt seals and otters and trade with the indigenous peoples. In addition, the coastal areas of Alaska were to be colonized step by step. However, as in almost all of America, this colonization came at the expense of the indigenous peoples. They were forced to adapt to the customs of the newcomers, learn Russian, and adopt the Orthodox religion. Many who refused to follow the Russians' instructions were deported and killed. Even though the colonization of Alaska initially seemed useful for the Russians, the province was never really profitable. This was mainly due to the enormous distance from Moscow and St. Petersburg and the seemingly endless transportation route. It was impossible to get from St. Petersburg to Alaska by ship at that time. The Northwest Passage via America had not yet been discovered at that time. There was only the land route to the Pacific coast and the crossing of the Bering Sea by ship, but the decline in the fur trade due to intensive hunting meant that Alaska became less and less important for Russia. However, the arrival of other major European powers such as the Spanish and British also gave the Russians competition in Alaska. It was the British in particular, who were in the process of building their global empire, that the Russians feared. When Russia ran into additional economic difficulties after the year 1853 as a result of the Crimean War, it was clear that it would have to sell its unprofitable colony. However, the Russian leadership did not want the huge territory to fall into the hands of the British. After all, it was also Great Britain that stood by the Turks in the Crimean War and defeated Russia. As the empire was militarily far superior to the Russian Tsarist Empire, the Russians would have had nothing to oppose an invasion of Alaska. They therefore wanted to get ahead of the British and at least make a little money by selling the colony. The only first buyer that came into question was the United States. Russia had already offered to sell it to them in the year 1859. However, the USA was so torn internally by the American Civil War at the time that a purchase was still delayed. However, the Americans had the same goals as the Russians. After the British sided with the secessionist southern states in the Civil War, the United States wanted to avoid a further British presence on the American continent at all costs. In the year 1867, negotiations were resumed between the two parties and an agreement was finally reached. The U.S. Secretary of State at the time negotiated a purchase price of $7.2 million, which would be equivalent to around $120 million today. After approval by the President and the Senate, Alaska was finally officially ceded from Russia to the United States in October 1867. Alaska Day is therefore still celebrated today on October 18th. The curious thing is that the purchase was considered useless by many American politicians at the time, as the land had no known raw materials or strategic use at the time, and it seemed incomprehensible why so much money should be paid for a barren icy landscape. As a result, Alaska continued to be extremely sparsely populated and only a few military bases were established. This only changed with the discovery of gold and the subsequent gold rush at the end of the century. Later, the largest oil field in the USA was also found off the coast of Alaska, which is why the territory is now of inestimable value. In addition, the salmon and crab fishery there has become one of the largest in the world. In the future, Alaska's strategic importance could increase even further. As the Arctic Ocean melts, one of the main shipping routes between Europe and Asia could run via the Bering Strait, and important trading cities could be established on the Alaskan coast. The purchase has therefore proved to be a real boon for the United States throughout history and can therefore be described as one of the greatest bargains in history.